Picture this. You're standing in the frozen wilderness of Siberia. The year is 1991. Russian scientists have just made a discovery that will shake our understanding of ancient survival to its core. Buried beneath thousands of years of permafrost, they uncover the perfectly preserved remains of a woolly mammoth. But here's what's truly mind-bending. When they examine the meat, some of it is still so well preserved that it's technically edible. This 40,000-year-old flesh has survived longer than entire civilizations have existed. Now, fast forward to your modern kitchen. Leave a piece of meat on your counter for just a few hours, and it's already starting to spoil. So how did our ancestors, living without electricity, refrigerators, or even basic chemistry knowledge, manage to preserve meat for months, even years? How did they unlock secrets of food preservation that kept entire civilizations from starving? The answer lies in techniques so ingenious, so perfectly adapted to harsh realities, that some of them still baffle food scientists today. This is the story of humanity's greatest survival hack, a mystery written in salt, smoke, and ice that spans continents and millennia. Before we dive into the ingenious solutions, we need to understand the problem that haunted every ancient civilization: the race against rot. In a world without refrigeration, meat began its deadly transformation within hours of slaughter. Bacteria multiplied exponentially, turning life-sustaining protein into poison that could kill entire families. For our ancestors, this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a matter of survival or extinction. Imagine being a hunter in ancient Mesopotamia, around 8000 BCE. You've just brought down a massive aurochs, an ancient wild ox that could weigh over 2,000 pounds. Your tribe celebrates. This single kill could feed everyone for weeks. But there's a terrifying countdown ticking in your head. In the sweltering heat of the Fertile Crescent, you have perhaps 24 hours before this blessing becomes a curse. This scenario played out across the ancient world, with variations that would determine which civilizations thrived and which vanished into history. The tribes that mastered meat preservation didn't just survive, they built empires. Those that didn't often left nothing behind but archaeological mysteries. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of humanity's earliest innovations weren't tools for hunting or farming, but techniques for preserving the hunt's bounty. Cave paintings in France, dating back 30,000 years, don't just show animals being killed. They show what appears to be meat being processed and prepared for long-term storage. But perhaps the most chilling reminder of what was at stake comes from the historical record. The Donner Party's tragic fate in 1846 wasn't just about being trapped in snow. It was about the complete breakdown of food preservation in extreme conditions. Even with 19th century knowledge, they couldn't prevent their supplies from spoiling, leading to one of history's most notorious survival stories. The ancient world was full of similar crossroads, where the difference between preservation and spoilage meant the difference between civilization and collapse. The first breakthrough came from one of Earth's most abundant yet precious resources: salt. But this wasn't just any preservation method. This was humanity's first chemical weapon against decay, and its discovery changed everything. The ancient Egyptians elevated salt preservation to an art form that borders on the mystical. Around 3000 BCE, they weren't just preserving meat, they were preserving human beings for eternity. The mummification process they perfected reveals a sophisticated understanding of how salt draws moisture from organic matter, creating an environment where decay simply cannot exist. But here's where it gets fascinating. Recent analysis of Egyptian mummies has revealed that their preservation techniques were so advanced, they achieved results that modern food science is still trying to replicate. The natron salt they used wasn't just sodium chloride. It was a complex mixture of sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and other minerals that created the perfect preservation environment. Archaeological excavations in ancient salt mines tell an even more dramatic story. The Hallstatt salt mine in Austria, operational for over 3,000 years, contains evidence of an entire civilization built around salt preservation. Workers' lunch remnants, perfectly preserved in the salty environment, show us exactly what people were eating 2,500 years ago. We're talking about pieces of meat that are older than the Roman Empire, yet still recognizable. The Romans took salt preservation to industrial levels. They established vast salt works across their empire, and Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, giving us the word salary. But they did more than just coat meat in salt. They developed a technique called wet curing, where meat was submerged in concentrated brine solutions for weeks at a time. One of the most extraordinary examples of Roman preservation mastery comes from Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it didn't just preserve the city, it preserved the food. Archaeologists have found perfectly intact cured meats in Pompeii shops, still hanging from their hooks after nearly 2,000 years. The volcanic ash created a natural preservation environment, but the meat had already been processed using Roman techniques so effective that they survived a volcanic apocalypse. However, salt preservation wasn't without its dangers. Historical records from medieval Europe describe entire communities suffering from what we now know as salt poisoning after consuming improperly preserved meat. The line between preservation and toxicity was razor thin, and ancient preservers walked it with the skill of tightrope artists. The most controversial aspect of ancient salt preservation involves evidence suggesting some civilizations made of practiced forms of preservation we can barely comprehend today. Tibetan monks developed techniques using natural salt deposits combined with high-altitude conditions that could preserve meat for decades. Some of these methods remain closely guarded secrets, passed down through oral tradition, and still practiced in remote monasteries. While salt was humanity's first preservation revolution, smoke represented something far more primal and mysterious. The mastery of fire didn't just give us warmth and protection. It gave us the power to stop time itself. At least when it came to meat. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed smoking techniques so sophisticated that early European explorers couldn't believe what they were seeing. Salmon runs would bring millions of fish upstream for just a few weeks each year. In that brief window, these master preservers would capture and process enough protein to last through months of winter. They built elaborate smoking structures called smokehouse villages, entire communities dedicated to the art of preservation. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. When Lewis and Clark encountered these preserved salmon stores in 1805, some of the fish had been smoked over a year earlier and were still perfectly edible. The explorers, desperate for food after months of wilderness travel, described the smoked salmon as better than anything they could have gotten fresh in civilization. The secret lay not just in the smoking process, but in the precise selection of woods. Different woods imparted different preservation properties. Cedar contained natural preservatives. Alder provided specific antimicrobial compounds. Oak delivered tannins that created an additional barrier against spoilage. This wasn't random experimentation. This was sophisticated organic chemistry practiced by people who understood the molecular properties of preservation without ever seeing a molecule. Archaeological evidence from ancient smoking sites reveals techniques that food scientists are only now beginning to understand. Some Native American tribes created smoke compositions using specific combinations of wood, bark and leaves that produced chemical compounds we're still identifying today. These weren't just flavoring agents. They were complex preservation cocktails that could extend meat's shelf life for months. The Vikings took smoking technology to the extremes of human endurance. Their survival depended on preserved meat during months-long ocean voyages where fresh food was impossible. They developed portable smoking techniques that could preserve meat aboard wooden ships in the middle of storms. Viking sagas describe warriors surviving entire Arctic winters on nothing but smoked meat and fermented dairy products. Recent archaeological discoveries in Greenland have uncovered Viking smoking installations that operated continuously for over 200 years. The amount of preserved meat they processed was staggering. Estimates suggest single installations could preserve enough meat to feed hundreds of people through entire winters. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of ancient smoking involves evidence of techniques that seem to defy what we know about preservation science. Aboriginal Australians developed smoking methods that could preserve meat in tropical climates where bacteria thrive. They somehow managed to create preservation environments in conditions where modern food science says long-term meat preservation should be impossible. Some anthropologists believe these techniques involved understanding atmospheric pressure, humidity control, and chemical interactions that we're only now beginning to research. The knowledge was often considered sacred, passed down through initiation ceremonies, and protected as closely as any military secret. The most controversial theory suggests that some ancient smoking techniques may have involved controlled fermentation processes that created preservation environments more sophisticated than anything we use today. If true, it would mean our ancestors understood advanced biochemistry centuries before we discovered bacteria existed. While salt and smoke dominated preservation in warmer climates, the masters of ice developed techniques that turned winter itself into a massive preservation system. But this wasn't simply about keeping things cold. It was about understanding ice as a complex preservation medium that could be controlled, shaped, and optimized. The ancient Persians built some of humanity's most impressive ice preservation structures, called yakhchals. These massive dome-shaped buildings could store ice through scorching desert summers. But here's what's truly mind-bending. They built them in regions where winter temperatures barely dropped below freezing. They were creating and maintaining ice in desert climates using nothing but architectural ingenuity and understanding of thermodynamics. The yakhchals worked through a combination of evaporative cooling, thermal mass, and precise airflow control. They could maintain near-freezing temperatures inside, while outside temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Recent engineering studies of these structures have found design principles that modern refrigeration technology is only now adopting. But the true ice masters lived in the Arctic regions, where they developed preservation techniques that turned ice into a precision instrument. The Inuit didn't just bury meat in snow. They created sophisticated ice storage systems that could maintain different preservation environments for different types of meat. They understood that different types of ice had different preservation properties. Sea ice, with its salt content, created different preservation conditions than freshwater ice. They learned to control the rate of freezing, understanding that slow freezing created different crystal structures than rapid freezing, each with its own preservation advantages. Archaeological evidence from ancient Arctic settlements reveals ice cellars that operated for generations. These weren't simple holes in the ground. They were engineered structures with controlled drainage, ventilation, and temperature regulation. Some could maintain frozen conditions year-round, even during Arctic summers. The most remarkable example comes from Siberian archaeological sites, where researchers have found ancient meat preservation installations that used permafrost as a natural freezing system. But these weren't just holes dug into frozen ground. They were sophisticated structures that controlled the interaction between stored meat and the permafrost environment. Recent discoveries have uncovered preserved meat in these ancient Siberian installations that's over 1,000 years old, but still shows signs of controlled preservation. The meat wasn't just frozen, it was preserved using techniques that combined freezing with other preservation methods in ways that created preservation environments more stable than modern freezing. Some of the most controversial archaeological evidence suggests that ancient Arctic peoples may have developed preservation techniques that could maintain meat quality for decades. These techniques apparently involved understanding the interaction between freezing, dehydration, and controlled decomposition that created preservation states we can't replicate today. The mystery deepens when we consider that some of these ancient preservation sites show evidence of maintaining different preservation environments simultaneously. They could keep some meat frozen, other meat partially dried, and still other meat in controlled fermentation states, all within the same storage facility. Modern food scientists studying these sites admit they don't fully understand how these preservation systems worked. The ancient ice masters seem to understand principles of preservation that we've either forgotten or never learned. Perhaps the most mysterious and sophisticated preservation technique developed by ancient peoples was controlled fermentation. This wasn't just letting meat rot in a controlled way. It was harnessing the power of beneficial microorganisms to create preservation environments that could last for years. The ancient Chinese developed fermentation techniques that transformed meat into products that could survive for decades. Archaeological evidence from Han Dynasty sites shows fermented meat products that were stored in sealed containers for extended periods. But what makes this truly extraordinary is that recent analysis of residues from these containers shows that the ancient Chinese understood the specific bacterial cultures needed for safe fermentation. They weren't just hoping for the best, they were cultivating specific microorganisms and controlling fermentation environments with precision that rivals modern food science. They understood temperature control, pH balance, and bacterial interactions without ever seeing bacteria under a microscope. The nomadic peoples of Central Asia took fermentation to extremes that seem almost impossible. They developed techniques for fermenting meat while traveling on horseback across vast distances. They created portable fermentation systems that could maintain controlled bacterial environments while bouncing across steppes for months at a time. Historical accounts from medieval travelers describe Mongol warriors surviving entire campaigns on nothing but fermented mare's milk and fermented meat products. These weren't emergency rations. They were sophisticated preserved foods that provided complete nutrition for months without any fresh ingredients. But perhaps the most mysterious fermentation techniques were developed in the Arctic regions, where controlled fermentation seems like it should be impossible. The Inuit developed a fermentation technique for preserving sea mammals that involved burying meat in specific conditions that promoted beneficial bacterial growth even in freezing temperatures. The process, still practiced today in some remote communities, creates a fermented meat product that can be stored for years without spoiling. Modern microbiologists studying these techniques have found that the bacterial cultures involved are incredibly complex and stable. The fermentation creates an environment so hostile to harmful bacteria that the meat becomes essentially immune to spoilage. Recent research has revealed that some traditional fermentation techniques produced preservation results that modern food science considers theoretically impossible. The ancient fermenters somehow managed to create bacterial environments that were simultaneously stable, safe, and nutritious for extended periods. The most controversial aspect of ancient fermentation involves evidence suggesting some cultures developed techniques that involved human intervention in bacterial cultivation. They may have understood how to isolate, cultivate, and maintain specific bacterial cultures for preservation purposes. Some anthropologists believe that certain fermentation techniques were so sophisticated they represented early biotechnology. If true, it would mean our ancestors were practicing controlled microbiology thousands of years before we understood what microorganisms were. The knowledge was often protected as sacred information, passed down through specific lineages and protected with the same secrecy as military technologies. Much of this knowledge has been lost, leaving us with archaeological evidence of results we can't fully explain or replicate. As we piece together the story of ancient meat preservation, we encounter techniques so advanced and mysterious that they challenge our understanding of what was possible without modern technology. These lost techniques represent knowledge that vanished with the civilizations that developed them, leaving behind only tantalizing clues about preservation methods that may have surpassed anything we use today. The most intriguing evidence comes from high-altitude civilizations in the Andes Mountains. The Inca developed a preservation technique called charqui, the origin of our word jerky, but their version was far more sophisticated than anything we produce today. Recent analysis of Incan preservation sites reveals they understood how to use the unique atmospheric conditions at high altitude to create preservation environments that could maintain meat quality for years. They somehow learned to harness the combination of intense UV radiation, low oxygen levels, and extreme temperature variations to create natural preservation conditions. Modern food scientists studying these sites admit they don't fully understand how the process worked, but the results were undeniable. Preserved meat that could survive for decades without spoiling. Archaeological discoveries in remote Himalayan regions have uncovered preservation techniques that used combinations of altitude, mineral deposits, and controlled air circulation to create what can only be described as natural preservation chambers. Some of these installations show evidence of continuous operation for hundreds of years, suggesting they understood principles of preservation that we've lost. Perhaps the most mysterious lost technique involves evidence from ancient Egyptian sites that suggests they may have developed preservation methods that went beyond mummification. Recent discoveries in remote desert locations have uncovered what appear to be industrial-scale meat preservation facilities that used combinations of mineral deposits, controlled dehydration, and unknown chemical processes. The preservation results achieved at these sites surpass anything modern food science considers possible using the materials and techniques that should have been available to ancient Egyptians. Some researchers speculate that they may have developed preservation techniques that involved chemical processes we don't fully understand. The mystery deepens when we consider that many of these advanced preservation techniques seem to have disappeared suddenly from the archaeological record. Civilizations that had mastered sophisticated preservation for centuries suddenly stopped using these techniques, as if the knowledge simply vanished. Some historians believe this represents one of humanity's greatest losses of technological knowledge. The techniques that allowed ancient peoples to preserve meat for years may have been more advanced than anything we use today, but the knowledge disappeared during periods of conquest, plague, or social collapse. The most controversial theory suggests that some lost preservation techniques may have involved understanding of chemical and biological processes that we're only now beginning to research. If true, it would mean that our ancestors achieved preservation results that we consider cutting-edge, using methods we can't replicate. Modern food scientists working to understand these lost techniques face a frustrating challenge. They can see the results in archaeological evidence, but they can't understand the processes that created those results. We're left with the humbling realization that in some aspects of food preservation, we may have regressed rather than advanced. As we stand in our modern kitchens, surrounded by the hum of refrigerators and the convenience of industrial food preservation, it's worth pausing to consider what we've learned about our ancestors' ingenuity. They faced a challenge that would have meant extinction for their people: how to preserve life-sustaining protein in a world that seemed designed to make it rot. Their solutions weren't just clever adaptations to difficult circumstances. They were sophisticated technologies that, in many cases, achieved results we're still trying to understand and replicate. From the salt masters of ancient Egypt to the fermentation wizards of Central Asia, from the ice engineers of the Arctic to the high-altitude preservation specialists of the Andes, our ancestors developed techniques that challenge our assumptions about what was possible in the ancient world. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story isn't the techniques themselves, it's what they tell us about human adaptability and innovation. Faced with the fundamental challenge of survival, ancient peoples didn't just find ways to keep meat from spoiling. They turned preservation into an art form, a science, and sometimes a spiritual practice that connected them to the natural world in ways we're only beginning to understand. Today, as we face new challenges around food security, sustainability, and preservation, we might do well to remember that some of humanity's most sophisticated food technologies weren't developed in modern laboratories. They were perfected by people who understood that the difference between preservation and spoilage was often the difference between life and death. The next time you open your refrigerator or grab a piece of processed meat from the store, remember that you're benefiting from a chain of innovation that stretches back tens of thousands of years. Our ancestors' fight against spoilage wasn't just about survival. It was about creating the foundation for every civilization that followed. The question that haunts researchers today is this: in our rush toward modern convenience, how much ancient wisdom have we lost? And more importantly, what could we learn if we took the time to truly understand the preservation masters who came before us? Perhaps the greatest preservation technique our ancestors developed wasn't for meat at all. It was for knowledge itself, passed down through generations of careful observation, experimentation, and innovation. That knowledge survived longer than any piece of preserved meat, and it continues to challenge and inspire us today. The mystery of ancient meat preservation reminds us that human ingenuity knows no bounds, and that sometimes the most advanced technologies are hiding in the wisdom of the past. If you found this journey through ancient preservation techniques as fascinating as we did, you'll want to explore more mysteries of human survival and innovation. Our next investigation takes us into the secrets of ancient navigation. How did people cross vast oceans without GPS, compasses, or even maps? Subscribe to join us as we uncover more incredible stories of human ingenuity that shaped our world.